Have you ever wondered what happens when the system meant to protect us becomes the very thing we need protection from? Before you continue watching, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal is the kind of story that rarely reaches the public eye. You're among the first to witness how a single moment of injustice sparked a revolution that's changing courtrooms across America right now. This exclusive story has already inspired thousands, and I promise by the end you'll see why judges, lawyers, and everyday citizens are calling this the case that redefined American justice. Don't miss a second. Subscribe now and join the community that's witnessing history unfold. The morning sun cut through Charleston's Spanish moss as Alexandria Bennett stepped out of her silver sedan. The federal courthouse loomed before her like a fortress, imposing, unwelcoming, a monument to power that had rarely served people who looked like her. She straightened her navy blazer, gripped her leather portfolio, and ascended the stone steps with dignified purpose. Each click of her heels against concrete was a quiet declaration. Alexandria didn't wear her judicial robe outside the courtroom. She never did. She preferred to enter buildings as a citizen, observant, composed, invisible. But on this day, that invisibility would become her greatest weapon. At the security checkpoint, Deputy Marshal Jackson, a court bailiff notorious for his old-school attitude, narrowed his eyes as Alexandria approached. He didn't recognize her. More importantly, he didn't try to. "Ma'am," he said, voice gruff with unearned authority. "Step out of line." Alexandria paused. "Is there a problem?" Jackson's eyes swept over her, from her silver-streaked locks to her pressed slacks, to the quiet confidence in her gaze. Something about her bothered him. She looked like she belonged there. And in his world, people like her needed to be reminded who was really in charge. "No ID displayed. You can't waltz into a federal building looking like that." Alexandria calmly reached into her blazer and produced her federal credentials. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but Jackson barely glanced at it before pocketing it. "I'd like that returned," she said, her voice steady but firm. Jackson stepped closer, invading her space. "You in a rush to get somewhere, sweetheart?" The word hung in the air between them, like poison. A female security guard shifted uncomfortably nearby. She recognized the tension but remained silent, another witness choosing the safety of silence. "I need to get to a courtroom," Alexandria stated. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Jackson snapped. "And that includes random checks." Without warning, one heavy hand gripped her upper arm, steering her toward a windowless screening room beyond the security zone. The air inside was unnaturally still, made heavier by what was about to unfold. "I don't consent to this," Alexandria said clearly. "You have no legal cause to detain me. You're acting suspicious." "That's cause enough," he replied, motioning to a steel chair. "Sit down." She remained standing. In an instant, two other officers entered, one grabbing her wrist while another held the chair. Alexandria's voice rose, not in fear, but in declaration. "This is a violation. I want your names." No one answered. Instead, Jackson grabbed a pair of clippers from a nearby cart. The device buzzed to life, filling the room with the angry sound of mechanical bees. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Standard protocol," he sneered. "You could be hiding something in that mop." Before she could react, the cold vibration touched her scalp. Alexandria felt a thick coil of silver hair fall to the floor. Then another, and another. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She sat there as her dignity was stripped from her, strand by strand, watching it collect in piles on the tiled floor. The officers laughed. The casual cruelty of men who'd never faced consequences. "Looks better already," one muttered. "Should have come in here with some respect," Jackson said, brushing loose hairs from his sleeve. Alexandria's fists clenched in her lap, but her voice, when it returned, was glacier cold and steady. "You'll regret this." Jackson leaned down, his breath hot on her face. "People like you always say that." Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. Jackson opened the door and gestured toward the hall. "You're free to go. Courtroom's that way," he said mockingly. Alexandria rose slowly, reclaimed her badge without asking, and walked out with measured steps. Her expression remained unreadable, but beneath her calm exterior, something burned hotter than rage and deeper than humiliation. It was purpose. And in just minutes, that purpose would change everything. Because what Jackson didn't know What would soon send shockwaves through the entire courthouse was that Alexandria Bennett wasn't there for anyone else's judgment. She was the judge, and she was about to take her seat on the bench. The Clipper's buzz echoed in Alexandria's ears, with each step toward courtroom 3. Not out of fear but fury. Contained, focused, weaponized. Her scalp tingled where her silver coils had once grown. Years of growth, a crown of identity and heritage, now reduced to uneven tufts. Yet she didn't slow her pace. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Passing 2 clerks who glanced at her then quickly averted their eyes, Alexandria continued forward. They'd heard. Maybe they'd even seen. But not one had spoken up. The murmur of voices filtered through the courtroom's double doors. It was a high-profile morning, a police misconduct hearing, involving officers from a protest incident last year. National attention. Heavy press coverage. Under normal circumstances, Alexandria would have entered through her private chambers, donned her robe with the help of staff, preserved the ceremony of justice. But these were no longer normal circumstances. She paused outside the courtroom, took one deep breath, then pushed both doors wide open. The room fell instantly silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned toward the interruption. Then, as Alexandria walked down the center aisle, the realization began to ripple through the crowd like an electrical current. Her shoes clicked loudly against marble as she passed rows of lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared in confusion, others in dawning horror. At the front, behind the judge's bench, her chair sat empty, waiting. And then it hit them. The woman they'd watched be escorted through the hall, the woman whose scalp bore fresh evidence of brutality, wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was Honorable Judge Alexandria Bennett. Alexandria stepped behind the bench and turned slowly to face the packed courtroom. Her face was calm, not the kind of calm that comes from peace, but the deadly stillness that precedes a storm. Someone near the defense table dropped a pen. The bailiff, Deputy Marshal Jackson, the same man who had held the Clippers minutes earlier, stood frozen by the side door. His lips parted, but no sound emerged as the blood drained from his face. Alexandria didn't flinch. She reached for the black robe folded neatly on her chair and slipped it on. One slow, deliberate movement at a time. It settled on her shoulders like armor. She turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" Her voice betrayed nothing. The clerk's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." Alexandria nodded once, then lowered herself into her chair. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony on Case 2371F, United States v. Charleston Police Department," she announced as if nothing had happened. "Charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations. All parties present?" A murmur of "Yes, Your Honor," echoed back. The attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some wide-eyed, others guilty, a few visibly angry that a black woman had dared walk in after what they assumed had destroyed her. She ignored them all. "We will proceed." The first witness was called, an officer who had pushed an elderly veteran to the ground during the protest, breaking 2 ribs. Alexandria listened carefully, took notes, and asked no questions. Not yet. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Jackson slowly backing toward the rear of the courtroom, his hands twitching nervously at his belt. He looked like he wanted to disappear, sensing deep in his gut that his moment of reckoning approached. He was right. After the second witness, she called a recess. The courtroom emptied in uncomfortable silence. Even the lawyers whispered, as if afraid to disturb the charged atmosphere. When only her clerk, 2 officers, and Jackson remained, Alexandria finally looked directly at him. "Deputy Jackson," she said, her voice sharp as a surgeon's blade. He froze mid-step. "Why, yes, Your Honor." She motioned to the center of the courtroom. "State your full name for the record." "Marshal Jackson," he replied, moving like a man approaching his own execution. "How long have you served as bailiff at this courthouse?" 14 years. Alexandria tapped her pen against her legal pad. Once, twice, then leaned forward. "And in those 14 years, how many women have you assaulted in that screening room?" The color drained from his face. "I didn't know. That's not what I asked." He looked around desperately for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Deputy Jackson?" I'm not sure." 12. Alexandria stated, her voice rising not in volume but in precision. 12 formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed because you hid behind procedure and protocol. Jackson's mouth trembled. I didn't know who you were, and that's the problem, isn't it? She interrupted, her voice cracking through the stillness. You thought I was no one, just another black woman you could bully, shave, humiliate for sport. You didn't even bother to ask for my name. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Alexandria rose from the bench. Because of you, this courthouse, this supposed temple of justice, has been stained. The sanctity of this court is now under question, and because you assaulted a federal judge in her own courthouse, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation, effective immediately. She turned to the officers standing by the exit. Escort Deputy Jackson into custody, separate from general population. Formal charges to follow. The officers moved quickly, cuffs already in hand. No! Wait, Jackson shouted. You can't do this. But he was wrong. She already had. The courtroom no longer felt like a courtroom after Jackson was escorted out in handcuffs. The aftershocks lingered in the silence, in the ceiling fans that suddenly seemed to hum too loudly, in the sidelong glances shared between staff who had known for years and said nothing. Alexandria sat back in her chair, fingers laced over the bench, her judicial robe now draped over her like armor. There was no going back to the way things were before, and truthfully, she didn't want to. Something had shifted, not just inside her, but within the entire institution. Her clerk entered quietly. Your Honor, the next witnesses are ready. We have about 8 minutes. Alexandria nodded, looking past her to the empty gallery, where spectators would soon return. She could still feel Jackson's presence, like an oil stain on polished marble. The door behind her creaked. A young woman in her early 20s, Megan, a quiet intern, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, stepped inside, her glasses fogged from rushing. Everything okay? Alexandria asked. Megan hesitated, then closed the door and stepped forward. I saw what happened with Deputy Jackson this morning, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Outside the screening room. I didn't know what to do. I should have said something. I was scared. Alexandria studied the young woman's trembling hands. Thank you for telling me. That matters. I didn't stop it. No, Alexandria replied gently. But you're speaking now. That's more than most. Megan straightened her shoulders. If you need me to testify, I will. Alexandria reached across the desk and placed her hand over the intern's. A brief moment of human connection in the midst of institutional trauma. The courtroom doors creaked again. The public was returning. All rise, the clerk called out. Everyone did, even those who didn't want to, even those who had once laughed at Jackson's jokes behind closed doors. Court is back in session, Alexandria announced. As the next witness took the stand, Howard Thompson, a warehouse foreman whose 17-year-old son had been tackled and pinned during the protest, his windpipe crushed by an officer's knee. The atmosphere had transformed. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a reckoning. Howard spoke with hollow but determined eyes about begging for paramedics while being told, he'll be fine, he's faking. He recounted how no one listened, and how when footage emerged, none of the officers were disciplined. Alexandria didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every word was a blade slicing through the courtroom's facade, leaving no one untouched. When he finished, Alexandria leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, thank you for your courage. I know this isn't easy. He nodded, his voice cracking. I just want to know that it meant something. Someone is finally listening. Alexandria looked at him, not from the bench, not as a judge, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be silenced. You've been heard, she said. Minutes later, her clerk opened the door halfway. Your Honor, the U.S. Attorney's Office just submitted a sealed motion to escalate charges against Jackson immediately. Civil rights violations under federal law. Alexandria didn't blink. Good. Accept it. As the door closed, she finally allowed herself a breath. Not of relief, but of resolve. The real reckoning was just beginning. The afternoon session began with an electrified silence. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread about the morning's events. First about Jackson's arrest, then about the judge who had transformed from victim to avenger in the span of hours. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Camera crews hovered outside, Reporters lined the back rows, and civil rights attorneys had flown in from Atlanta, D.C. and Chicago. This wasn't just about a case anymore. It was history and justice colliding in real time. As Alexandria stood behind her bench, her clerk whispered, "They're here, the defense attorneys. They're asking for special counsel. On what grounds? They say the case is tainted, that the judge is personally compromised." A slow breath escaped her lips. Of course they would try to flip it. Unable to deny the facts, they would attack the messenger. Let them ask. I'll give them their answer on the record. Alexandria stepped out to a courtroom vibrating with tension. All rise. The room obeyed. She didn't look left or right, simply walked to her place, tapped her gavel once. "Be seated." A defense attorney in a pinstripe suit rose immediately. Confident, polished, with a voice trained for both jury trials and television interviews. "Your Honor, before we proceed, we'd like to make a formal request due to recent developments." Alexandria cut in. "You mean the arrest of Deputy Jackson and the incident in the courthouse hallway?" He hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor. These events may present a conflict of interest, a question of judicial impartiality." The gallery bristled with tension. "You're suggesting that because I was assaulted this morning, I can't carry out the duties of my position?" "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that the perception of bias." Alexandria held up her hand. "Let me stop you right there." She stood and walked slowly to the edge of the bench. "I was publicly assaulted and humiliated. Not for what I said or did, but for who I am. Because someone saw a black woman walking into a courtroom and decided she couldn't possibly hold power." She paused, letting it sink in. "And what did I do in response? I took my seat. I conducted this hearing. I followed every rule, every code of conduct. I have been calm, measured, and respectful, even when others were not." The attorney's jaw clenched. "Now you know what real bias looks like, counselor. Real bias is a man using clippers to shave off a woman's hair without cause, without warrant, and without asking her name. Real bias is 12 ignored complaints, from people who look like me, buried by this very institution." She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "You want to talk about conflict of interest? Let's talk about how many judges signed off on Deputy Jackson's behavior over the years. Let's talk about how many prosecutors declined to follow up. Let's talk about your firm's history of defending officers with abuse records longer than their resumes." He looked ready to object, but no words came. Because she was right. Alexandria straightened. "This court will proceed. I will not recuse myself. And if you believe the facts of this case cannot stand under my authority, you're welcome to appeal. I'll provide the paperwork myself." She tapped the gavel again. Next witness. The prosecution called Denise Taylor. Not a victim or protester, but a former courthouse employee. Middle-aged, sharp suit, cropped hair, glasses. She had worked in records for years. Quiet, efficient, never complained. Until now. After being sworn in, Denise adjusted her blazer as the prosecutor approached. "Miss Taylor, can you tell us about your former position at this courthouse?" "I was the record supervisor for 8 years. Before that, I worked the front desk. And during your time here, were you ever made aware of complaints against Deputy Jackson?" Her eyes hardened. "Yes. Too many to count. Can you estimate? 12 official, at least twice that many informal." "And what happened to those complaints?" Denise glanced toward Alexandria, then spoke slowly. "They were mishandled. Some were marked as resolved when they weren't. Some disappeared entirely." The courtroom stirred. "Who gave those instructions?" There was a pause, then Judge Terrence Wilson. That name hit like thunder. Wilson, retired 6 months ago. Reputation clean. Respected. Alexandria's own mentor. Why would he suppress those reports? Denise's voice shook, but she answered. He said bringing them forward would undermine public trust. That it would make the courthouse look weak. Alexandria sat perfectly still. That specific lie was one she had heard before. Justice delayed to preserve appearances. Abuse tolerated in the name of order. Denise continued. Stronger now. I watched men like Jackson walk these halls with impunity. I watched young black interns get searched and questioned. I watched witnesses get intimidated and brushed off. And every time I said something, I was told, "That's just how it is." Her voice cracked. "Well, not anymore." Alexandria swallowed hard. This testimony didn't just support a case. It cracked a system wide open. She called for recess. As she stepped away from the bench, a young reporter whispered to his colleague, "She's not just running this courtroom. She's rewriting it." And he was right. By morning, the courthouse steps were no longer quiet. What started as a few reporters with cameras had grown into a full crowd. Protesters, community leaders, citizens of all backgrounds. Some held signs, "Justice starts now." "Protect black women, 12 complaints. Zero accountability." Inside her chambers, Alexandria looked out at the growing sea of faces. This wasn't chaos. It was something heavier. Focused waiting. A knock on her door revealed Reverend Marcus Turner, a community leader she hadn't seen in almost a decade. His gray beard had grown in fully, his eyes tired, but kind. "Judge Bennett," he said. "Reverend," she replied, rising. "I won't take much of your time. Just wanted you to know, we are out there, we see what you're doing, and we're with you." She nodded, swallowing the sudden emotion pressing at the back of her throat. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Some of these people outside, they were victims too. Of Jackson, of others like him. They were never called into court, never heard, but they're ready now. If you want their stories, they're ready to talk. She unfolded the list, names, phone numbers, handwritten notes. It was longer than she expected. "How many of these are new complaints?" "Most. Some go back years. Some were afraid. Some were told it wasn't worth it." Alexandria looked up. "They were wrong. It is worth it now." Marcus smiled faintly. "It is because of you." When he left, she stared down at the list. These weren't just names. These were the people this courthouse had ignored, brushed off, laughed at, written off. But not anymore. Back in the courtroom, the gallery had doubled. Word of Denise Taylor's testimony had spread like wildfire. Reporters live-streamed as people outside watched on phones, huddled together in the October sun. When Alexandria walked in, the room stood again, but this time it felt different. Not just out of tradition, or for her title, but for what she represented. "We're ready to proceed," she announced. The next witness was unexpected. Andrew Carson from the U.S. Marshal's office, not to investigate but to testify. Black, late 50s, over 20 years of service, walking with a slight limp from an injury sustained years ago. After taking the oath, he adjusted the microphone. "I worked here from 2004 to 2012. I saw a lot. Most of it I let slide. I didn't want trouble, didn't want to be labeled the angry black officer." He looked straight at Alexandria. "But what I saw from Jackson, I should have reported. I didn't, and I regret it." Alexandria nodded slowly, allowing him space. He started small, disrespect, over-policing young men, making comments. But it got worse. By 2010, he wasn't just aggressive, he was dangerous. "Did you report him?" the prosecutor asked. "I filed a memo to Internal Affairs. It disappeared. When I asked about it, I was told, he's the kind of man we want handling difficult people." The room reacted with disgusted murmurs. "I left this courthouse 2 years later, not because of the work, but because of what it did to me." The silence, the guilt. Carson leaned forward. "But now I'm here to tell the truth. Because Judge Bennett, what you did, sitting in that chair after what they did to you, that's bigger than a bench." The room fell still, and Alexandria, for the first time all day, had no response. Not because she was speechless, but because sometimes when history arrives at your feet, you don't speak over it. You let it echo. The final day began with rain, not a gentle drizzle, but a downpour that washed over Charleston like both warning and cleansing. Streets flooded, power lines swayed, but still they came. Reporters, protesters, witnesses, spectators. Because everyone knew what was happening wasn't just justice, it was history. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, but electric, charged with the energy that precedes transformation. Alexandria Monroe walked into the courtroom silently. No gavel, no declaration. She paused at the bench, looked out at the packed gallery, and then, to everyone's surprise, took off her robe. She folded it gently, laid it across her chair, and stood before them without the protection of title or tradition. Just a woman, scarred but standing. "I've sat behind this bench for years," she began. "I've worn the robe, carried the title, delivered rulings, followed procedure, but I've also stayed silent, longer than I should have. And today, I'm done being quiet." She glanced to the defense table, to the prosecution, then to the citizens who had once been silenced. "This court finds Deputy Marshal Jackson guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct. But it doesn't stop there." She stepped forward. "This court recommends immediate review of every complaint ever filed under his name, and formal investigation into any official who suppressed them." She turned to the court reporter. "Put that on the record." There was no applause, only a silence that acknowledged the magnitude of what was happening. Alexandria reached for a folder beneath the desk, one that hadn't been opened yet. She held it up. "This is a policy proposal, effective immediately. I am instituting a mandate for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction." Her voice never wavered. "It's called the Bennett Mandate. It requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, regular evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior inside federal courthouses." She held it high. "I will take this to the circuit, to the judiciary, to the Senate if I have to, because what happened to me should never happen to anyone, and I'm going to make damn sure it never happens again." Movement stirred in the gallery, small nods, silent tears, hands gripping one another in solidarity. "I want to make something very clear," she continued. "This was never about revenge. It's about responsibility, accountability, about looking this broken system in the eye and saying not anymore." She turned to the defense and those who had allowed Jackson to operate without consequence for over a decade. "Consider yourselves on notice. I will be forwarding recommendations for disbarment, formal review, and possible charges to the Department of Justice for every official who played a role in burying the truth." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Then Alexandria looked up, past the benches toward the tall arched window. The storm still raged, but light was beginning to filter through, a beam of sun breaking across the marble floor. "Before we conclude, there's one more piece of business." She looked to the side entrance. Officers opened the door, and Marshal Jackson walked in, still in cuffs, no longer in uniform. His face was hollow, broken in a way that had nothing to do with physical harm. Alexandria faced him with fire, not vengeance. "Mr. Jackson, this court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law: 6 years imprisonment for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and an additional year for obstruction." She paused. "But that's just the legal part. Here's the human part." Her voice dropped, calm but slicing. "You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity, and who wasn't. You thought the badge made you immune. That silence would shield you, that people like me would never hold the gavel." Her eyes locked onto his. "Well, now you get to sit in the seat you made for others. No badge, no robe, just the weight of what you've done." She nodded to the officers. "Take him away." As Jackson was escorted out, no one cheered, no one clapped. They just watched, because this wasn't about celebration, it was about witnessing. Alexandria looked down at the file, the Bennett Mandate. She closed it, lifted her robe from the bench, and spoke one final time. "Court is adjourned." The courthouse emptied slowly, like a storm clearing. People lingered, touching banisters and door frames, as if connecting to a place that had until now felt like an impenetrable fortress. Alexandria sat alone in her chambers. The files were gone, the courtroom quiet. Her robe hung on the back of her chair, but everything was different now. Not because the burden was gone, but because it had been named aloud. She turned to face the mirror behind her desk. The uneven patches on her scalp had begun to grow out, silver coils returning, but slowly, unevenly. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was her sister, Nicole. No words were exchanged as she entered. Just a folding stool pulled from the corner and placed behind Alexandria's chair. Nicole pulled out a small pair of clippers and plugged them in. "You ready?" Alexandria met her eyes in the mirror. There was no fear anymore. Just resolve. Yeah, she whispered. Let's finish it. Nicole moved slowly, deliberately. Each pass of the clippers was careful, transforming what had been done in violence into an act of reclamation. When Nicole finished, she handed Alexandria a mirror. Alexandria turned it over in her hand, before finally looking. The reflection stared back. Bold, bare, strong, beautiful. You could rock that every damn day, and still own every room you walk into, Nicole said with a grin. Alexandria didn't answer right away, just stared at herself. This is who I am now. No, Nicole corrected. This is who you've always been. Now the rest of the world just caught up. That night Alexandria walked out of the courthouse with her head bare under the city lights. A small group of onlookers noticed her. Not media this time, just people. An elderly woman approached and gently placed her hand on Alexandria's arm. I never thought I'd live to see someone like you do what you just did. Alexandria took her hand. You did more than survive. You paved the road. A teenager approached shyly, pulled off her hoodie to reveal her own short-shaved head, and nodded. Alexandria nodded back, a silent inheritance passing between them. Later that night Alexandria stood on her porch, looking out over her quiet neighborhood. Inside, her phone buzzed with texts, emails, news alerts, but she let them wait. Tonight wasn't about the noise. It was about finally hearing herself breathe. The next morning Alexandria returned to work. Business as usual, at least on paper. But people noticed the subtle differences. The robes stayed off longer. The stares lingered differently. Not in dismissal but in recognition. In the judge's elevator, the janitor nodded with a small fist to his chest, a gesture of respect. A young security officer gave a subtle thumbs up. When she entered the courtroom for a routine civil dispute, the entire room stood before the clerk's announcement, something that had never happened before. The law didn't stop. There were more cases, more motions, more files. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in the rules, but in the room itself. Justice had a new face now, and it didn't apologize for the space it took up. Alexandria walked the halls differently, not louder or harsher, just fuller, like someone who had been made to shrink for years, and finally remembered what standing at full height felt like. Months passed. The Monroe Mandate spread, first within the courthouse, then across the district. Other judges adopted it. Other cities called about it. A bill was being drafted in Congress. One afternoon, Alexandria visited a middle school classroom. The teacher had invited her to speak about justice and courage. She expected a handful of bored kids, but the room was packed. They had watched the trial, read the articles. Some had written essays. Others made signs, including one taped to the chalkboard. Be like Judge Bennett. The kids asked the real questions. How do you stay calm when people hate you? What did it feel like when they cut your hair? Did you ever want to give up? She answered them all honestly. But the last question, from a quiet girl in the corner, stuck with her. Do you still believe in the system? Alexandria paused, then said, I don't believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become. And I believe in people like you asking that question. That's how it changes. When she left the school, she cried in her car for the first time in months. Not from pain, but from hope. Not long after, the White House called. Alexandria Bennett had been chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. The ceremony was elegant, formal, packed with dignitaries. But Alexandria cared only about who sat in the front row. Nicole, her clerk, Megan, now a first-year law student, Reverend Turner, and the quiet girl from the classroom who had asked the real question. As Alexandria stepped to the podium, applause rose like a wave, but she didn't raise her hand or wave. She simply began. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not because I wasn't qualified, not because I didn't earn it, but because for most of my life, systems like this one weren't built with people like me in mind. She looked out over the crowd, and when I finally stepped into the spaces I had worked my whole life to reach, I was still reminded that I didn't belong. A long breath. But I stayed. I stood, and I made them see me. She paused. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I was one of the lucky ones who survived a moment that should have broken me, and because I knew too many who weren't as lucky, Her voice strengthened. Today I accept this not for myself, but for every person who ever walked into a courtroom, a workplace, a school, or any institution, and was made to feel less than. This is for you. This is because of you, and this is just the beginning. She touched her shaved head. No longer a symbol of humiliation, but of power. Justice isn't just a word on a building. It's what happens when we refuse to be silenced, when we stand our ground, when we make them see us. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words, it was for a promise finally kept. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. This is just one of many powerful stories of justice and transformation we're bringing to light. Comment below with your thoughts. What moment hit you hardest? What would you have done in Alexandria's position? And remember, sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. Sometimes it comes from those brave enough to stand against it. Join our community of truth seekers today by subscribing, and never miss another story that could change how you see the world.